Hey Simran, how are you?
I am good. How are you?
Oh, I'm hanging in there.
How's
Uh,
the move?
it's been okay. I'm still reporting to you live from my folks' house while my home continues to be under construction. We're just, you know, we're, our renos are going fine. I don't have anything to complain about with the work product. It's taking longer than we expected, but fortunately, it's not costing more than we expected. And working with the contractors we have has been relatively um, painless. So all in all, I don't have too much to complain about. How are things at your end?
Funny enough, I'm reporting from my parents' place as well. I
Hmm,
actually redecorated my dad's office for Father's Day, but it was really more of a gift for myself because I knew I'd
it
be
looks
moving
great.
in. So I don't think they thought I would be a roommate for as long as I have been, but house hunting has been very painful.
Same with me. My parents were definitely not expecting us to be around for as long as we were, but we've managed to keep everything civil and stay out of each other's hair. And they really like playing with their grandson. That's exciting for them and for him. So
I think we're poster
much to
children for
complain about.
adulting.
Yeah, yeah. Let me ask you a question. Did in the last place that you had, did you ever get one of these video doorbells for your front door?
I got the works, and I gotta tell you,
Yeah.
I used that video doorbell exactly 0 times.
Yeah. You know, we we're looking at getting some kind of a home security system because this is the first house that we've owned. And every time okay, first of all, every time I go to look up a uh, uh, a, a different home security company, the first thing they do is say, give us your email so we can send you free promotions. And the home security company then proceeds to send you like 6 spam emails a day about how they're waiting for you to respond. Like, this is not the way to reassure me that you have the interests of my security and privacy in mind. We got a question, I think, for today about internet harassment. So like more on harassing people over the internet and over email later. But anyway, so all of the companies in all of their offers, it always is, sign up for this package and get a free video doorbell. Um, and my wife and I started talking about it, and we had like a really long, intense conversation about, do we actually want a video doorbell on our house? And we started worrying about, like, who does the doorbell, like, who's seeing the footage of the video doorbell? Where is this being stored? Like, are we being filmed by our own video doorbell? Did you ever have problems with that?
I did. I mean, I'd get these notifications on my phone with this video, and honestly, I never actually relied on it. But the idea that this footage was just out there is just it's just something very unsettling about it, which is so ironic because the entire purpose is to give you peace of mind, but it's
Yeah.
like the exact opposite.
Yeah. Like every time I think that for me, every time I would see the doorbell, I would just, it would just make me more stressed out.
Well, funny enough, I did invest in one of those little cameras because I have always been very curious about my what my dog does when I'm not home. So I set it up in our
Mm.
family room to watch him, and of course he jumped on every single couch in the family room. But then
Yeah.
one day I realized it was still on, and I was sitting in the family room. And when the roles were reversed, not so much fun. I don't know. I'm not a big fan of this idea of someone watching, but it kind of
Yeah.
brings us to one of the topics I know you and I wanted to talk to everybody else about today. So hello everybody. Um, Paul and I some time ago were talking about just privacy and how privacy has kind of come to evolve in the workplace and just overall with technology advances, and especially with the pandemic around as well. So we thought it would be interesting to talk about that today and get some of your questions on that as well.
Yeah. Um, I, one of the questions that I know had come up is whether it's whether we think it is reasonable or utterly terrifying that our employer may have the right to record us when we work from home.
Yeah, I actually came across an article a couple of weeks ago, and it surprised me because ultimately they did find that the employer was acting reasonably and having technology installed to essentially watch their employees while they remotely worked from home. It wasn't camera, but it was basically tracking data. And the whole rationale was that an employer has the right to kind of oversee employees, but that it needs to be proportional to also account for privacy interests. But then how you really interpret that on a case-to-case basis, that's where I think it starts to get, sometimes it can get a little messy and a little unsettling.
I have so many thoughts. Simran, I have so many thoughts.
Oh, please go back.
Yeah, let's start the show. Welcome to Legally Adulting, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Join us for Legally Adulting.
Adulting is not supposed to be easy.
What are the questions and concerns that we as young people have about living through a pandemic? So welcome again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for Legally Adulting. We've been doing these sessions now. Paul, you're going to have to remind me because I think we're coming up to, I want to say 2 years.
Yeah, over a year of which now I think has been like this over Zoom.
Yep. My name is Simran Bakshi. I'm an associate lawyer at Wise Law, and Paul Adam is here with me today as well. We're both associates. My practice is primarily in employment law and family law, and I dabble a little bit in civil litigation as well. And Paul is primarily, he's our estate guy. So any questions about wills and estates, he's your guy. And he also does a lot of civil litigation. And I always tell him, I think his cases are the most interesting. I'm always so jealous.
And I always tell Simran that the other lawyers that you work with seem so reasonable and just such a pleasure to deal with. I think in all of the times that I've heard you on the phone with other counsel, I never heard you raise your voice or say anything more direct than, well, I think I understand your position.
I will say the employment bar is amazing. It's just, you contrast it with family law, the bar is a little, sometimes it can get a little tense, but I can't complain about employment law at all.
So tell me more about this question about employers recording us from our homes.
Well, I'll tell you, I think it's actually evolved a little bit because I remember being on a file some time ago, and it was like your routine employment law file where someone had been let go and you're negotiating just a package. And then in the course of this, her employer, I think it was in one of their letters, referred to something that she had said verbatim in an email to a personal friend. It had nothing to do with the workplace. But this was during the course of her employment. She was using a company laptop, sent off a personal email, and then somehow the exact language she had used in this email showed up in, a comment made by the employer. And so of course guards went up and she wondered, like, how on earth do they know what I'm saying in my personal emails? And we kind of came to realize that there was some kind of tracking device installed in her company laptop. And that suddenly, what was once a very simple employment law case kind of evolved into something that was completely different, where the issue really was, has there been a breach of privacy? And I remember at that point when we looked at the law, it was pretty egregious for an employer to be doing something like that. But now you start to see the case law, and I'm not saying this applies in every case, but I think there seems to be some kind of further acknowledgement that with the world changing and how we work changing, and the employer not necessarily having that traditional workspace where they can pop in and see if Bob's doing his work, that some form of security or oversight for the employer to be able to see and track productivity isn't as unreasonable as you'd expect. But it's all going to be a question of balance, because I don't think an employer, as an example, we did have a case where an employer wanted to essentially watch the person on camera all day long. Like that, I don't think is going to be considered reasonable. I think for many reasons that's troubling in itself. But if an employer wants to track what websites you're going to, that's been around for quite some time, or have some other kind of productivity software installed, I think we're going to start to see that being more and more accepted.
Why? I feel very naive for asking this question, especially in the year 2021. But why wouldn't it be enough for your employer to be able to measure your productivity by how much work output you create relative to what your employer is expecting you to put out?
I think that in certain workplaces, you're right. I think that is the standard, that if you can measure output, that would probably be the least intrusive way to go about doing that. But I think there's also an argument to be made that that's not every workplace. Unfortunately, not everyone can prove they're working based on having produced something that day. And in those circumstances, whether an employer has the right to just kind of make sure that everything's on track and how far they can go about doing that is kind of a question that I think we're going to see evolve. I don't think we're quite there yet. I think we've got a long way to go to see how you balance this new world of working from home, and that even that's not going to be the same. Like, we're already seeing a lot of employers insisting that employees come back to work, whereas some are kind of more comfortable with this idea of this ongoing work from home reality. But as we go along, I think we're going to see some changes as to what's reasonable and not.
And like, how long are employers going to be allowed to retain this video if they're filming employees?
I wish
And
I
like,
had
for
an
how long are they going to be allowed to use it?
You know, it's a really good question, because in employment law, generally speaking, if you get terminated, it can either be on a cause or without cause basis.
Mhm.
Most of the time, it's just a very high threshold to meet to establish cause. So most terminations will generally be on a without cause basis. But where there are some really, egregious misconduct or performance deficiencies, that's when we start to see the cause. And the question you raise is really interesting, because if an employer now has basically a library of just every wrong you've done over the past 5 years, I mean, at what point does accumulating that become a cause? And is that kind of bad faith on part of the employer to do that? Because, we can never make a mistake without that just being a mistake. It's recorded for all time. So I don't know the answer to it. I don't think a court's going to allow an employer to basically, pick a video from 4 years ago and rely on that as saying this was such bad misconduct. But I do think an employer now will have footage, and if they do come across something that's really concerning or problematic and they properly document it and it's real time, I think they can actually do something with it.
And like, when you provide information to like basically any website or anything, there's an expectation under, I know that they exist under some of the European Union's data privacy legislation. I don't know what's been implemented in Canada, but there's a provision in some of the new privacy legislation that exists in the world that after a certain amount of time, your private data is no longer stored and it'll be destroyed if it's not being used for anything useful. So would an employee have a right to expect that after a while, its employer will no longer retain video of the employee in, just sitting at home at their desk doing whatever?
I don't, I mean, I think what you're saying makes complete sense. I don't think we've got that definite direction as of yet, but quite honestly, I would be shocked if a court thought it was reasonable for an employer to have video footage from, 20 years ago and then look to rely on it in some way in litigation. I just think there's an element of bad faith that kind of goes with that. It also depends on the facts that we're speaking about. Like if there's footage of you misappropriating funds and sending yourself an e-transfer, probably a whole lot more relevant than if you take a personal phone call. So I think it also depends on what we're talking about, but it's a question of proportionality. That's what we keep seeing is this idea that you've got to balance the two competing interests and really look at what's proportional.
The way I have to say, the way I see this shaking out, maybe it's just the cynic in me, is that employees who are relatively who have relatively few powers and responsibilities within within their employer's hierarchy, like employees at the non-management level, will always be the ones who are being recorded. And when there are credible allegations against a manager or something that that he or she is harassing employees or engaging in inappropriate conduct, the company will always throw up its hands and say like, well, we can't record these people as they're doing their work. I just, like every other HR technique, I have the sickening sensation that this will always and exclusively be used for ways in which it benefits the company, and it will never be used in any way that benefits or advances the rights of frontline employees.
But I don't think you're wrong in my opinion, just because if you look at even now, like just a regular workplace, who actually is being tracked for time? You're not seeing like the VP of a bank having to punch in and punch out. It's the lower guy down there who's got to do that and got to account for, the 15 minutes that they weren't at their post. So I have a feeling it's going to be consistent with that. I think it's a bit ironic because at the end of the day, work product is just as important, if not even more important, the higher you end up in a position. But for whatever reason, there's a lot of concern with time theft. And it may well be because time theft is often one of the reasons relied on for a cause. Not always the best reason, but if the company feels like you're using time that is owed to them because they're paying you for that, I've seen it many times before where that becomes a reason to say, well, we had cause to let you go. You weren't working, from 12 to 2 o'clock because you were setting up your own website. So it can be a valid basis for cause, not always the best reason, but and that's why I think a lot of companies, if they are going to go in the direction of work from home, are going to be looking for some kind of protection to ensure that they're getting what they paid for. Well, are you seeing how are you seeing technology evolve in the wills and estates world? Because I know the way we used to execute wills, it's not even the same neighborhood of how we're doing it now.
It's interesting. I've now been at the point where I've been signing last wills on Zoom for about a year. And I think that, at least for me, it's really changed the way I do last will signings. The number of questions that I ask clients during will signings, because we record every client meeting on video, we save it in the client's file. I always want to take so many precautions to ask the client every conceivable question so that there's a written record about it, about their capacity, about their understanding of the contents of the last will, about whether they're signing the will voluntarily. And it used to be before I was doing these wills over Zoom, I relied a lot on my good judgment and about reading unconscious cues about whether a client was capable of signing a will or not, and whether this client was doing it voluntarily or not. Now I am so meticulous about asking so many questions during the will signing, and obviously this is the right way to do it. I'm not suggesting that um, I'm not suggesting otherwise, and I think I've learned a lot about uh, uh, I think I've learned and grown as an estates practitioner through going through this process. But you know, m- the meetings that we have to sign last wills are getting longer and longer as I think of more questions that I really want to get in there in order to satisfy each and everything that should be on my checklist for capacity. And again, this gets stored in the client's file forever. And that means that, um, everything about the will signing meeting is going to be there for the deceased's next of kin, and in theory, anybody who um, who uh, you know becomes appointed as that person's executor and asks to see my file after our law firm's former client has passed away, should that happen. And it's you have to try to really find balance between being very, very thorough and not not in the interest of asking so many questions of your client, setting up traps for the estate to fall into after the person um, has after the person has passed away. There have been a couple of instances where I ask a client a question like, do you take any medication? And the client gives me an answer about, a medication that they take, and then we have to spend another 3 minutes, just ascertaining, making sure for the record that, yes, the client takes this medication, but no, it doesn't have any effect on their cognition, or no, or yes, it could have an effect on their cognition, but their dose hasn't changed in this many years, and it's no reason to be concerned about the validity of the last will today. It's like it really just kind of opens a Pandora's box.
Is that something you were
Um,
doing before too? Like when you weren't on camera, or is it just because I think a lot of it is so subjective, right? You speak with
yeah,
someone and you make a mental judgment about if they've got capacity or not. And I think you're right. I don't think we necessarily would go the as far as you go when you know you're on camera and this is being recorded for all time. But it's so much of it is just based on your just cues and your judgment of it. And has that changed at all? Like, is there now a very firm checklist of what you go through? And do clients have concerns about being on camera?
I go through a pretty firm checklist, um, and I'm trying to make the checklist more and more firm all the time. So far, we haven't had any clients who have concerns about being on camera. Sometimes I think our clients are really eager to be on camera because they have a particular reason that they are excluding somebody from the last will, and they have very strong feelings about it, and they very passionately want to tell that to me on camera, um, which is, I don't know, some clients really want there to be a real, very clear record about why they disinherited this and this person. Other times, I think clients are a little reluctant to put that all on camera, on a video, even if the client, I would think the client would know that if it wasn't going on camera, they would know that the expectation would be that for me to discharge my job in accordance with the Law Society regulations, I would need to make very meticulous notes, some of which might contain my subjective judgments about what the client said and whether I thought it was true or not, in my notes for the file. So it's not like the clients ever should have expected that they were signing their wills inside a mystical black box. That's exactly the opposite of what a lawyer is supposed to be doing. But now I think it puts the issue a little bit more on the tape. But another thing that it's made me more conscious of is, making sure that I'm up to date on my knowledge and understanding of how all of the provisions of the last will can actually operate. Like, we've had a very standard provision in the last will about what kind of powers under the Income Tax Act an executor can exercise. And I knew I'm not a tax lawyer and I'm not an accountant, so I have a general working understanding of what some things that an executor could do under the Income Tax Act. But I find that now that I'm being recorded on camera, I'm like, every week before every last will meeting, I'm like, let me just read one more article on Mondac about what an executor is and isn't allowed to do with an income tax election. Let me just read about 2 more different examples of income tax elections that an executor is allowed to make, because I'm becoming much more self-conscious about, making comments about the contents of a last will that I'm not fully 100%, 20-year tax partner level informed about in these last wills.
Speaking of being on camera, I guess with the pandemic, all of the lawyers who litigate have had to get used to going to court online. And at first I loved it because I'm a commuter, and lugging around those little lawyer briefcases across the GO station and the TTC, not fun. But now I find that I'm so aware that I'm on camera. And I never had that in court. It was nice to kind of just be in my own little world in court and not see myself. But I find it very strange. Like today I had an appearance, and I could just see the facial expressions that I was making, and it was throwing me off. And it's going to take some practice.
Same. I'm so glad you said that, because I thought I was the only person. And when we used to be in court, the courtroom was actually usually quite physically large. It was like a big room, and the lawyers would all be in one area, and we would all be dressed the same, and mostly we would all be doing the same thing, all the hearings going on, which is just like, looking at stuff on your cell phone while we're waiting to be called upon. And now I find on Zoom, every lawyer looks a little bit different on the Zoom, and like some are closer to the camera and some are farther away, and like some, their camera's like this, and some their camera is like this. And
let's not forget about the cat filter lawyers.
Cat filter lawyers, the wearing shorts underneath the suit jacket and tie lawyers. And like some lawyers are clearly filming it from their teenage daughter's bedroom, and you can see their Blackpink poster on the wall behind you, because it's the room in the house that has the best Wi-Fi. I find that I'm much more judgmental of what lawyers look like and how they present themselves on Zoom, in exactly the way that 200 years ago, the concept of 400 years ago now, I guess, the concept of court attire was invented to be something that it acts as like a great leveler between all barristers presenting themselves before a judge.
I personally find it fascinating to see the judge's background. Like some of them will go with the normal court background, but some of them will actually be way more open. Like you can see their living room or their home office, and it gives you such a window into the person deciding your case. It's fascinating.
I'm convinced that one judge attended a hearing with me from her attic. Like I could literally see the rafters behind her head, like right over her head. I'm really sure that she was in some sort of um, attic in her house, and that's where she was recording from. It was so strange. I can't figure it out.
I think
Maybe
she
it was like one of those
mixed it
funky
up.
little office things in the backyard that people
Or
have.
maybe she just got bored and she needed to mix it up and make it interesting.
I don't blame her. Maybe she wanted to see if anybody was going to say something.
But speaking of interesting, we do have some audience questions, and now would be a really good time to maybe jump into them.
Let's hear them.
Saran?
Can my employer terminate me for refusing to get a vaccine?
That is a great question. And honestly, I feel like I'm looking up the answer every couple of weeks to see if things have changed. Most recently, I was referred to an article, and the lawyer really took a very strong stance on the answer to that question. And I don't necessarily know if I would go that far, but the general consensus seems to be, because this is a public health issue, and because an employer has a duty not just to ensure your safety, but to ensure the safety of the workplace, of all employees in the workplace, the sentiment seems to be that yes, the employer can inquire about whether you have been vaccinated, whether they can force you to get a vaccine. Now that kind of implies two things. Like, you've got to take each person as an individual, and not all of us are going to have the same medical background going into this, or there may be other legitimate concerns as to why someone chooses not to be vaccinated. And it would be a mistake not to account for that, especially when we're dealing with someone who's got a real medical reason why they can't do it. There's also just policy reasons. Not everyone is able to get a vaccine in their area. It hasn't rolled out exactly the same everywhere. So to force someone to get it assumes that they can get it, both from the availability and from a health perspective as well. So I wouldn't go so far as saying they can force you, but I do think, and we're probably going to need to get some direction from just the government and public health guidelines as well. But I do think we're heading in the direction where that an employer expecting employees to be vaccinated is not going to necessarily be unreasonable. I'm going to say the lawyer thing, it's also going to depend. It's also going to depend on what kind of workplace you have. What is your position client facing? Are you working closely with other employees? Are you by yourself? Is there a religious reason you don't want to get it? Is there a medical reason? Is there just some kind of obstacle that prevents you from getting it? I think we're going to have to weigh all of it in order to decide if an employer is being reasonable by mandating that an employee gets a vaccination. But in general, I think the direction that we're heading in is it's not going to be unreasonable for an employer to expect that from an employee.
So what you brought up some really good points about when, presumably most adults are getting vaccinated now and want to get vaccinated, and some people either do not want to get vaccinated for reasons, or they're not able to get vaccinated genuinely. But like if an employer is trying to weigh a question of whether it's going to require an employee to get a vaccine, even if the employee for some reason, cannot, like, is this going to wind up being treated any differently than any other case in which an employer needs to make accommodations for an employee?
It's really a question of whether it is an accommodation. So firstly, an employer has a duty to accommodate if it's something that falls under the Human Rights Code. So when we're talking about grounds like religion and disability and age and sex and all of that. But they don't just have a general responsibility to accommodate. Like if you are just not a morning person and you tell your boss, hey, listen, I'm going to come in at 12, please accommodate me. Probably not going to happen. But if you are on medication and you're drowsy and you can't report to work at 9 a.m., totally different situation. And I think the same is going to apply with the vaccine. It's really going to depend on the why. And it's going to be really interesting just from like just watching this pandemic unfold. because there are people who just have general anxieties about vaccines and the unknown and not knowing how that's going to affect them. And I'm going to leave my personal opinions aside about all of that, but there's going to be some really interesting intersections that apply. Like if you're just if you have some major anxiety about this, maybe not the most rational anxiety, does that at some point spill over to being somewhat of a disability that prevents you from getting the vaccine? And is that reasonable? Because you're now also putting somebody else at risk, arguably, in my opinion. And like, is that reasonable for the employer to prioritize your concerns over the far more proven risk of what would happen with you being unvaccinated in the workplace and potentially exposing other people to the coronavirus? So it's going to be one of those, I would say, law school questions where you've got to balance all these different interests along with the Human Rights Act, along with the Charter, which also imposes equality overall, and kind of see and just common sense about how you deal with a pandemic in a workplace and limit the exposure overall. So I don't think we're going to have any direct answers, but if I were to bet, I would say we're going to get some kind of direction from the government. And it's not just going to be in the employment arena. I'm sure we're going to see it all across about what you can and can't do if you've been vaccinated.
And I really feel for you as an employment lawyer on this, because I feel like as time in the world goes on and the pandemic changes form and the nature of the coronavirus as a public health risk also changes with herd immunity changing and the variants that are out there changing, like how you strike that balance right now may not, I wonder if it will be applicable even in 5 years from now. Like, is an employer going to be able to say that, refusing to get a vaccine or refusing to get, I don't know, revaccinated, who knows what's going to happen in the future, is as pressing a concern in like 2025 as it was in 2021. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, fair points, all of it. And I think it's a confusing time, but it's also an interesting time because you're actually seeing law made. And we talk about the law evolving, and you're actually seeing it evolving much faster than you would ever see it, in normal times. But by the same token, like as an employee or even an employer, it's very confusing to understand what you can and can't do. And I think that's where I sympathize with people, because it's hard to not know what the next couple months are going to look like. I think we're much further ahead now. I mean, if you remember how 2020 was, every day was a different just hypothesis and worries and concerns. And I'd like to be the optimist and say we're getting to the other end of it. But I think from a legal perspective, there's going to be all these novel questions that come up, and it's going to be a very interesting time.
Yeah. What isn't interesting about these times that we're living in right now, right?
Yeah. I think we had another question along the same lines as well.
By the way, if anybody out there is watching our presentation today and you have questions for us, submit your own questions with the chat function, and don't forget to like and subscribe.
Can a potential employer ask me if I've been vaccinated?
Along the same lines, again, it's that balance of a right to privacy as an employee, just overall, and an employer's obligations and under the Occupational Health and Safety Act to ensure that they're maintaining a safe and healthy workplace for everybody overall, all their employees. And so I think the direction we're heading in is, yes, they can ask you, because how can they ensure the safety of the workplace if they don't know who's been vaccinated and not? But again, I like to think that this would spill over into the human rights world. It won't necessarily, because I'm trying to play this out in my head. If you refuse to be vaccinated because of a disability, your employer asking you about that still doesn't necessarily amount to discrimination, in my opinion. So I just don't see, I don't see why an employer wouldn't be able to ask that, especially bearing in mind their obligations overall.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's again, I mean, like the general consensus has been a firm yes, they can ask. I wouldn't go so far. I would say it's a bit more of a gray, but at the end of the day, I think the employer is going to want to know in order to even just plan. You know, if you're not vaccinated, should you be perhaps doing something different? Should you not be exposed to as many people? So there are some really legitimate reasons for knowing. The right to privacy overall, I mean, while it's a general principle, there's really no legislation in Ontario that applies to private workplaces. So
Yeah.
keep that in mind as well, which is again a factor for why an employer can probably ask.
Hmm. Any more questions from the audience for today?
What are the important elements of constructive dismissal?
So a constructive dismissal is one of those words that gets thrown around, and I don't know, it's not the easiest concept to understand. So to begin with, what a constructive dismissal is essentially the right to resign from your job, but to say as a matter of law, I've been forced to resign. Like this isn't me just freely resigning. I've been compelled to do it because of the changes that you've made to my position, or it's just fundamentally not the same job that I signed up to be doing. So the most common examples are, you know, you are demoted from your role, or you take a significant pay cut, or your duties and responsibilities are cut in half, or you know, you get all your management duties are reassigned to someone else. But then you can also see examples where you're just subject to a really toxic work environment. If you go into work every day and you're miserable, crying in the bathroom because your manager is just yelling at you every day, I mean, that's not the job you signed up to be doing, arguably. And by the same token, it can be discrimination. So if you're not being accommodated in your job, and you need it because of a disability, that's again not the job you signed up for, because under any job in Ontario and Canada, you've got the right to actually be accommodated for your disability and for your religion and those grounds that are protected by the Human Rights Code. So it's really this idea of just you no longer wanting to work or being able to work because the job isn't what it should be. And with regards to a constructive dismissal, the elements to really keep in mind is you need to build up to that constructive dismissal. So it's not something you should just trigger because you think you've been wronged. It's a lot more tactical than that sometimes. And it's a really good idea to reach out to a lawyer if you're starting to feel that things are just not working out, your spidey sense is kicking in and you can tell that just something is amiss. Give us a call. We deal with these questions all the time. And what we like to do on our end is, as part of the consultation process, really kind of hold your hand to get you to that point where from where you feel like uncomfortable, like something's not right, to the point where you're ready to trigger that constructive dismissal. Because that paperwork and that how you record your story up until that point is really going to matter if you end up in litigation. Like you repeatedly asking for your duties to be reinstated and being shot down. And I know it's probably so frustrating for that to happen, but for you to document that, you know, 6 months down the road, if you're sitting in court, you're going to be relying on those emails to say, I did everything I could to try to get my job back. The employer wasn't cooperating. And so by this date, when they had changed my role, I had no option. I was compelled to call this a constructive dismissal. So it's a tricky area of law. You should definitely be in touch with a lawyer. We do consultations. So if you ever feel like you're in that situation, just give us a call and we'll kind of walk you through what we think of your situation, if we think it could possibly be a constructive dismissal, and just what kind of steps you should take and how to report it properly.
Why go to a lawyer like you, Simran, rather than going to, let's say, your company's own HR representative who they've they put out there to supposedly assist you with a problem like
Yeah.
this.
I was going to say because I'm utterly delightful, but I don't think that's the right answer.
Well, that's part of the right answer, right?
Well, it's also because let's remember that if you go to HR, I mean, if you're looking to depart from this company or you think the end is coming, HR is the company. So as much as you can go to them for help, and you should go to them for help and document that in a certain way, at the end of the day, their job and their position and role is to protect the interests of the company. They should also be trying to resolve the issue, and a lot of HR professionals are great at that. But sometimes when things are just not going in the right direction, it can quickly snowball. And what a lawyer can help you do is kind of recognize, A, if that's happening, and if it's happening, how to document it and protect yourself in case you do want to litigate. And honestly, Paul, a big part of our jobs, and I know you know this firsthand too, is telling people when you don't need to litigate. Like not every problem is going to end up in litigation. The happy endings are there where you can try to resolve something early, or your employer actually recognizes that they need to do something differently, or maybe you recognize you need to do something differently. Sometimes it is just miscommunication that can be resolved. And as part of our consultation process, that's a big part of it too, is recognizing where there is a case, where there is something that's not quite right, and where there isn't, and where there's something in between that can possibly be resolved.
So do you ever find that a potential client will come to you, but how do I put this, may have some reservations about retaining you because they don't think that things have gotten bad enough to really justify having a lawyer in the picture? I know that that's sometimes a question that potential clients of mine seem to have, that they seem to have some kind of um, uh, unconscious fear that if they retain our law firm, it means that the situation is completely hopeless, and it means that they've sort of, it means that in some ways, by signing a retainer agreement with us, they're burning some other bridge. Do you ever find that comes up?
I do. I mean, I think in the employment law world, we don't we don't emphasize it as much, but it is such an emotional process. Some people have been working for this employer or an employer for 20 plus years, and to suddenly kind of even articulate that things are not going well and it's coming to an end, it can be just as hard emotionally as it is just even from a legal perspective to win the case. Sometimes the first battle is to recognize if enough is enough. And sometimes, honestly, there is a non-litigious way out. So it's not always going to be, go after your employer for all the money you can get from them. Sometimes it's really a question of, is there a viable claim? Is it worth it based on your objectives? It's not always going to be about the money for everybody, and people have different objectives. So aligning what we can do with what you want to happen is a really important part of that consultation process too. And at least in my practice with employment law, sometimes you don't want the lawyer to be in the picture right away. Like sometimes what we can do is be more involved in the background.
Totally.
I'm sure you have experiences the same in civil litigation, where it's just more of a, let's carefully draft this letter, but let's still have it come from you, and let's see where it goes from there.
That's such a big theme in estates too, like especially when we have cases where somebody just wants their, uncle or mother or brother, whoever, to just give them a copy of the last will of a person who's passed away. And they're saying, does this person have to give me the last will? And I always say, yeah, I mean, you can ask them to give you the last will, and there's no reason for them not to give you the last will. And I say, we're more than happy to write a letter on your behalf. And they kind of flinch at the idea of me getting involved. And what I always say is the same thing. The first step we take doesn't have to be a letter that says, dear so-and-so, we represent the very scary law firm of Wise Law Office, and we have been retained, and you are hereby put on notice that forthwith you are to immediately deliver post haste to our client, and so on and so forth. Like,
I like the forthwith in there. Very effective.
yeah.
Yeah.
We actually got, we've got a little bit of time left. We actually got a super interesting question from Facebook that I wanted to share with you because it dovetails so nicely with what we've been talking about today. Somebody asked us, what would the courts describe as a toxic work environment?
It's going to depend on the facts. I know I've said that at least 20 times today, but it really will. Overall, if you're going into work and it can be so subtle. Like, it doesn't have to be someone screaming and yelling at you. Sometimes it can be a whole little microaggressions, repeatedly over and over and over again. Sometimes it is that one person that one time calling you a terrible name and yelling at you. So it's going to depend situation to situation, but ultimately it's just unwelcomed behavior. If you're going into work and you're not feeling good, it's almost like playground rules. If you go to school and you feel like you're being picked on and bullied, chances are something's not quite right. And at the very least, it's an interpersonal issue that needs to be resolved as well. So I think you need to kind of gauge it from a personal perspective as well. Everyone comes in it with different perspectives, but at the end of the day, if you're not feeling right about going into work and you're feeling pretty miserable about it, what I always say is it doesn't hurt to speak with a lawyer, to just have them be a soundboard, hear about what your situation is, let you know if objectively they're hearing it as something that might be poisonous or not. But that's kind of the way I would deal with something like that.
I also feel like this must be a question that is at least somewhat in the eyes of the beholder too. Like, for some people, they may, I imagine, I think you had a case like this once that, their colleagues by and large were nice to them, but their work environment had become, toxic to what they were trying to do in life because they had signed up for one job and they were, just being asked to do something totally different, and all of their responsibilities were being taken away from them. And that might not be toxic in the sense of, somebody is calling you um, a racist name, or somebody is, you know, um, stealing your wages, but somebody, if you've been sold a package of goods, so to speak, about your employment, what your kind of job you're going to have, and you're just being asked to do something totally different that you're not going to succeed at, and you're not going to succeed at. That's like something that can be, not toxic in the sense of malicious, but something that's toxic in that, like, you're just totally allergic to it.
Mhm.
In
Well,
your
you bring up a good point in terms of malicious. Like, I don't cite me on this. I'm fairly certain that intention actually isn't as big of a factor in a poisonous work environment.
interesting.
It's more the question of what kind of environment is it. I'm just remembering we had a case and it was a really long-term employee. And I remember I was so new back then, and I was reading the fact pattern or the facts from the intake, and to me it just really didn't seem really all that bad. It was, little things here and there that she wasn't very happy about. But then I'm speaking with our senior lawyer. It was very interesting perspective, because you put those little things together and you add in this person's very long-term history, and the fact that this person had been extremely loyal to this one employer. And so every time they did something, something as little as moving her parking space, 4 spots over, that to her was like it was a very painful thing to have to go through. It was not recognizing what she had put into this company. And you add that in, and suddenly this becomes a really unbearable, toxic work environment even if the employer didn't actually mean for that to happen. But for them to not recognize that these little tiny changes that they were putting into place was really having an impact on this person, that does have the elements of a poisonous work environment. So it's not always deliberate.
You know, when you say that, what this reminds me of is an article I read once about a person who said that it was a thought piece about a person who said that she wound up divorcing her spouse because he always left dirty dishes in the sink. And she was expanding on her thought process about, why am I divorcing my husband just because he leaves dirty dishes in the sink? And it wasn't the fact that he actually left dirty dishes in the sink. It was the fact that she had expressed that, it is important to me that you not leave dirty dishes in the sink. And it doesn't cost you anything else to put them in the dishwasher.
Wonder if we just lost Paul.
Hello? Can anybody hear me?
I can hear you now.
Oh, so, she was saying, I don't want you to do this. You know that the fact that I've asked you to do this and you just keep forgetting sends me a signal that this doesn't matter to you and that you don't care about the fact that this is hurtful to me. And I imagine that something small but niggling like that in an employment relationship can eventually feel the same way. Like the parking spot example that you gave is such a good one. Like, is it just a parking spot? Yes. Who cares? Sure. But if you know that the parking spot is important and your employer knows that you know that the parking spot is important, and or if you have one client that is important to you and they take away that one client and assign it to somebody, and that feels like a slap in the face, even if they replace it with something of a different value, like subjectively in a really long-term relationship with a company, I can see how that would make you feel like you want a divorce from your employer.
Honestly, that one case, I want to say an article in Student at the time, and it's guided me on constructive dismissals from that point on. Like, I will never make the mistake of not really fully understanding the dynamics between an employee and an employer, because to understand why that one slight dig affected someone as significantly as it did, there's almost always a story behind it. And I think that goes to the question of why it's toxic and why it's poisonous. And without really understanding that, you're never going to get to the bottom of why someone's so affected by something.
Mm-hmm.
Can you believe we're out of time?
I can't. I never can.
It's always so much fun, isn't it?
It is. What any good true crime hits this week?
You know what? I've been in family court at least 2 of the 4 days so far, so I have so much to catch up on. What about you? Have I convinced you to listen to true crime? Are you into that?
Am I into true crime? I'm listening to, it's not really, is it true crime? It's not exactly true crime, but there's a podcast right now on Stitcher about the Cuban Revolution and about the history of American interference in Cuba. It's called Blowback. They just did the entire season for Stitcher Premium, but now they're releasing all of the episodes for free. And it is, well, okay, this is very loose on the definition of true crime, but it is a true crime in the sense that you could make the argument that the United States sanctions against Cuba are like totally criminal in the amount of medicine and necessary life improving supplies that have been denied to the Cuban people for so many years. Not to mention the fact that in the 60s, the CIA did truly engage in crimes in an effort to overthrow Fidel Castro. But yeah, that's what I'm listening to.
There's
Blowback.
actually a movie that I don't know if you caught it. I think it's on Netflix. And I wish I could remember what it's called, but I know it's got Penelope Cruz in it. And it's all about that. It's such a good movie. It's just it's half of it's in Spanish. But still, it's totally worth. If you can figure out what it's called, highly recommend.
If anybody knows, tell us the name of the movie in the comments.
Free prize.
Yeah.
But thank you all for joining us. It's been a blast, and we can't wait until the next one.
Yeah, we'll see you guys soon.
Join us for Legally Adulting.
Adulting is not supposed to be easy.
What are the questions and concerns that we as young people have about living through a pandemic?